As the Killing in One war came to an end in Korea in 1954, the seeds of another far bloodier and traumatic war were just being planted. As the French relinquished their control in the area, following their defeat in the Dien Bien Phu Valley in May, French Indochina was divided up into Cambodia, Laos and Vietnam. All three nations would suffer from internal communist guerrillas, and peace would be a long way off for the region. Cambodia would suffer under the Marxist-Leninist tyrant Pol Pot, with the Communist Party of Kampuchea going on to commit many atrocities and mass executions on the killing fields of Cambodia, leading to nearly a quarter of its population dying. Laos would see North Vietnamese troops invade during the Vietnam War, and this would result in the US Air Force bombing the country with a weapon load that very nearly matched the total amount of bombs they dropped around the globe during the Second World War. Many bombs failed to explode, resulting in the contamination of large areas of land with armaments that still claim the limbs and lives of civilians today. Vietnam was divided at the 17th parallel, with the view that future elections would bring the nation together. Before they could take place, though, the South aligned themselves with America, and in the North, the Communists took control. For the Americans, who disliked European colonialism, the ending of France's influence in the region and the alignment of South Vietnam with their government appeared to be a favourable outcome, but Vietnam had become another fault line, waiting to bring misery and suffering to its people. In May 1955, the Warsaw Pact was signed by the forces of the communist-controlled states to confront the forces in the West under NATO, and the Eastern Alliance, or Evil Empire as one American president would later call it, now spread from the Bering Strait in the east all the way to the River Elbe in the west. With nations deciding for themselves, either by the vote or the bullet, which path to take, both superpowers were fully aware of the importance of propaganda. Up to now, the Cold War had seen propaganda as the weapon of choice for the Soviets and the Americans, because direct confrontation could lead to nuclear weapons being used. Events had been dominated by earthbound matters up until now, but things were about to change as the Russians discovered a spectacular new way to embarrass their rivals. It is often said that without the Russians, the Americans would never have landed on the moon, because without their rivalry, the paranoia that sparked the space race would never have existed. The 29th of July 1955 could make a claim to be the date when the space race began, because on that day, President Eisenhower's press secretary announced that as part of the International Geophysical Year, America was going to send scientific satellites into space. The measurements taken in space by the American instruments would contribute to the scientific results gathered during the IGY. Just 4 days later, the Soviets responded by declaring that they would also be launching a satellite into space. Intelligence did exist to back this claim up, but President Eisenhower either didn't believe it or didn't want to believe that they were capable of doing so. At that time, Russia was perceived by many Americans as a backwards nation, good at building tractors, but lacking the capability to launch anything as sophisticated as a spacecraft. On the 20th of September 1956, a US Army Jupiter C rocket could potentially have become the first rocket to place an object into orbit, albeit a part of the rocket itself and not a specific payload. Whether this could have been achieved or not, we shall never know, because the fourth stage was made inert and filled with sand. President Eisenhower had seen the death and destruction of the Second World War and was resolute in his determination to keep the military out of space. Instead, the fourth stage reached an altitude of 682 miles and travelled 3,350 miles from Launch Pad 5 at Cape Canaveral without achieving orbital velocity. As scientific endeavour entered the fray, any signs of liberalism or movement away from communist control were forcibly stamped out, as in the 1956 crushing of the Hungarian Revolution. The Uprising had been an attempt to leave the Warsaw Pact following the death of Stalin, when a new Hungarian government under Imre Nagy had proposed sweeping reforms. Once again, the Soviet leadership took ruthless action to quell the uprising by sending in troops and tanks. Nagy turned to the West for help in an attempt to stop the Soviet retaliation, but none came. In his final address, Nagy said, "Today it is Hungary, and tomorrow, or the day after tomorrow, it will be the turn of other countries, because the imperialism of Moscow does not know borders." 200,000 Red Army soldiers took 2 weeks to bring the country under control, during which 20,000 Hungarians died. As a warning to all other leaders in socialist countries, Nagy was hung on the orders of the Soviet leadership. Such was the manner in which the struggle for freedom from oppression and the right to demonstrate and express free speech was dealt with under Soviet control. The following year, in August 1957, one of the problems that faced the Soviet Union regarding the delivery of their weapons was solved when it launched its first intercontinental ballistic missile, meaning that, in theory at least, it now had the means to deliver its nuclear weapons onto the home soil of its enemies. In reality, the possibility of delivering nuclear weapons onto enemy soil by missiles was remote, and would remain so until the 1960s. Until a reliable delivery system was developed, both sides would rely on aircraft to deliver their weapons. Instead of using this new rocket for destructive purposes, the Soviets instead fulfilled their stated intention of placing satellites into orbit. On the 4th of October 1957, the Soviets extended the Cold War into space and shocked the world by putting Sputnik 1 into orbit, leaving Americans wondering how long it would be before nuclear weapons were dropping from the skies. Sputnik 1 beeped its signal down to Earth as it circled high above, causing widespread consternation. And Khrushchev taunted the Americans by saying, "The United States now sleeps under a Soviet moon." Next into space went Sputnik 2 in November of that year, carrying a dog, and Soviet propaganda celebrated their early successes as the world looked on in wonder. Not only were these two satellites intimidating in their exposing American skies to the frightening prospect of orbiting missiles, but the sheer size of them led many in the West to put the Soviets ahead in the arms race. Ironically, it was America's superior technology and expertise in militarization that resulted in their now being unable to compete with the heavy lift capability of the Soviets, whose own inferior technology resulted in them having to have a rocket with a greater lift capacity to carry their bulky warheads. The Soviets were apparently sprinting ahead in the space race, while America was having trouble getting out of the starting blocks, let alone keeping pace. In response, the Americans were trying, and publicly failing, to launch tiny payloads in comparison to their Soviet counterparts. The 6th of December 1957 saw the United States' first attempt to place a satellite into orbit, but it ended in a fiery explosion in front of a television audience as the Navy's Vanguard research rocket exploded seconds after liftoff, following a loss of thrust. The tiny Explorer satellite rode along the ground, forlornly emitting its signal. President Eisenhower's non-military approach to America's space program had resulted in public and embarrassing failure. With two Soviet satellites in orbit, the Americans were unable to place even a tiny ball into space. It appeared that for the US space program, failure was the only option. One newspaper carried the headline, "Oh, what a flopnik." The American public now had Soviet satellites passing over their country with no apparent way to counter them. The fear was that Soviet missiles could place nuclear warheads into space, ready to rain down on their heads at any time. The American people demanded action, and the pressure was on for an American satellite to be put into space. It wasn't too long until the Americans were ready to try again, with the Juno 1 rocket being used to attempt to place the Explorer 1 satellite into orbit. On the 31st of January 1958, the rocket successfully delivered America's first satellite into orbit, where it would remain until the 31st of March 1970. The Soviets had further success during May 1958, when Sputnik 3 was placed into orbit, a 1.3-ton instrument package that corroborated the existence of the Van Allen radiation belts. To the outside world, it seemed like Russia was not only winning the space race, they were leading the way in space science research. On the ground, the Soviets were rampant in Eastern Europe, suppressing uprisings and wielding an iron fist, by deploying soldiers and tanks at will. In space they were humiliating their rivals and revelling in the propaganda it afforded them. Americans, it seemed, were too busy being soft, capitalistic Westerners, more interested in the latest washing machine and car designs to counter the steel of the Soviet communist machine. To meet the challenge laid down by the communists' early success in space, the civilian space agency NASA was formed on the 1st of October 1958. And although men would initially enter space atop military rockets, the moon program would be a purely civilian endeavour. As President Eisenhower had wanted, there would be no militarization of space. History could have been very different. The Americans could have been the first into orbit, but at what cost? The military would be running the show, NASA might never have been formed, and space might not have been one of exploration, but one of tense confrontation. It might have led to disagreement and delays on the ground too, as the armed forces argued about who should take control of the new battlefield. It could be said that President Eisenhower may have lost the battle for space, but he prevented a possible war up there. As 1958 gave way to 1959, the Soviets aimed even higher and started sending spacecraft to the moon, and in January they missed it by 3,730 miles with their Luna 1 spacecraft. Back on Earth, 1959 saw actions in two countries that would ignite the fuse on two events that in one case would bring the world to the brink of nuclear war, and in the second result in the deaths of tens of thousands of Americans.